a lamp that never went dark, and a body left beside it. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Your voices bring this mystery alive. Let's begin. It was one of those nights when Paris seemed to exhale slowly, the streets damp and glistening under a fine, persistent drizzle. From his office window at Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret watched the blurred lamps along the embankment, their yellow halos stretching over wet pavement where a few late pedestrians hurried with collars turned up. He had not yet lit his pipe. Instead, he sat with his large hands folded, listening to the faint sounds of typewriters in another room, the occasional shuffle of a clerk, the muted ringing of a distant telephone. The day's official work was done, but he remained, as he often did, suspended in that odd hour between duty and retreat to his warm apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir. Madame Maigret would be waiting, perhaps already arranging supper on the table, a stew that had been simmering all afternoon. He pictured her moving quietly around the kitchen, checking the clock now and then, wondering when her husband would decide to rise from his chair. He thought of her with a certain tenderness, the domestic rhythm of their life as much a part of him as the cases that never seemed to leave him alone. He finally lit his pipe, the familiar ritual easing his restlessness. Smoke drifted toward the ceiling, mixing with the smell of rain seeping through the half-open window. The city seemed unusually subdued that evening, as if holding its breath. And it was then that the telephone on his desk gave a short, abrupt ring. Not the official line, but the smaller black set reserved for calls routed directly from colleagues on duty. He let it ring a second time before lifting the receiver, his deep voice answering with a simple Maigret. A sergeant on night rotation, his tone hesitant, explained that there had been an unusual report from a small boarding house on Rue des Batignolles. Nothing violent, not yet. Only that a tenant had not been seen all day, though the lamp in his room had been burning steadily since the previous evening. The landlady, an anxious widow, had finally called the police station when the man failed to answer her knocks. She feared illness, or worse. The patrolman sent to check stood uncertain outside the locked door, reluctant to force it without orders. Maigret listened, puffed twice on his pipe, and answered slowly, "I'll come." He hung up, reached for his heavy coat and hat, and walked down the corridor without hurry, his footsteps echoing. On such nights he did not rush. He knew too well that it was not the scene of action that mattered, but the moments before, when the atmosphere revealed itself and people betrayed themselves through worry, fear, or indifference. Outside, the rain had thinned into mist. The streets smelled of wet stone, horse dung from a cart gone by, and the faint grease of cafes shutting their doors. Maigret walked rather than took a car, his bulk moving steadily beneath the umbrella he rarely opened. A little water never hurt him. The city around him was familiar, comforting in its way. Anonymous rooms above bakeries, tobacconists still open for the late smoker, children's toys forgotten in doorways. He observed all without staring, storing impressions that would surface later when needed. By the time he reached the Rue des Batignolles, the gas lamps were casting weak circles of light over narrow facades. The boarding house stood modestly between a laundry and a wine shop, its plaster walls streaked from the rain. A policeman in a cape straightened as Maigret approached, saluting awkwardly. The landlady herself waited in the entrance hall, a small, pale woman wringing her hands in a checked apron, her voice trembling as she explained once more about the lamp that had stayed on, the unanswered door. Maigret removed his hat, nodded, and stepped inside, breathing in the faint odor of boiled cabbage and damp coats hanging in the corridor. The house was silent except for the drip of water from the umbrella stand. He did not ask many questions. He looked at the faces, the worried landlady, the uncomfortable policeman, and let silence linger long enough for their unease to deepen. People spoke more in silence than under pressure. At last he said simply, Show me the room." The landlady led the way up the creaking stairs, her shoes squeaking faintly. On the landing, a thin line of light shone beneath a closed door. Maigret stood before it, pipe in hand, listening to the faint hum of the lamp within. He felt a curious heaviness in the air, that quiet forewarning he had come to recognize over years of police work. Not a cry, not a shot, only that slight wrongness that clung to ordinary places before tragedy revealed itself. He touched the door, then glanced at the policeman. "We'll open it," he said calmly. And in that moment, though no crime had yet been confirmed, Maigret already knew that the night would not belong to supper on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, nor to the peaceful company of his wife. It would belong to the room where the lamp had burned too long, beside whatever secret it was illuminating. The key turned with a reluctant scrape, and the chain caught after a hand's breadth. The landlady glanced at Maigret as if she had been hoping for a reprieve at the last instant, but his expression didn't change. He nodded to the policeman, who produced a penknife and, with slow care that seemed almost apologetic, worked the small screws at the latch. It took time. The landlady whispered that in 30 years she had never had to force a tenant's door. Maigret's pipe went out, and he did not relight it. He stood very still, listening to the house listening to him, the faint ticking from somewhere deeper inside, the water whispering down gutters, a floorboard complaining, beneath someone's cautious foot on the landing below. When the chain gave, he pushed the door open softly with 2 fingers, as if not to startle the room. A narrow, plain space set under a sloping ceiling received them, the electric lamp on the table painting a circle of light over a blotter, a glass ashtray, a cheap fountain pen lying uncapped on a page, the ink stiff and half-dried into a dark skin. The bed was made, a cotton coverlet drawn smooth, no dent. On a chair by the window hung a grey jacket with rubbed elbows. The radiator clicked faintly as it cooled. The window had been closed. Condensation fogged the panes. The air smelled of warm dust from the lamp, stale smoke, something faintly metallic. The man lay on the floor slightly to the left of the table, on his side, as if he had allowed himself to slide down from the chair but had not chosen a spot for his head. He wore his shirt and trousers. No shoes. His feet were in socks, which had caught dust. One hand was half-curled near the table leg, the other beneath his chest. There was nothing theatrical about him. Middle height, thinning hair, the kind of face one forgets after buying stamps at a post office window, but the skin around the neck, just below the left ear, showed a smudged darkening that did not belong to natural sleep. The collar button had torn loose and dangled by a few cotton threads. He had not been young, but his mouth, slightly open, had an expression that was not old either, surprised, perhaps, or disbelieving at how quietly he had been stopped. Maigret did not kneel at once. He stepped to the table, put a finger on the lamp's green shade, and felt the warmth. The shade was dusted unevenly. Clean arcs showed where a hand had turned it more than once, adjusting the light's direction. He looked at the page. Figures in 2 neat columns, and beside them a small list of names. The pen had left a drying blot. In the doorway, the landlady made a sound half-strangled between breath and speech. The policeman shifted, his boots squeaking. Still, Maigret said nothing. He bent then, one knee on the floor, and placed a hand lightly near the dead man's jaw, not to learn anything the doctor would tell him later in words, but to feel the temperature against the air of the room. Not fresh. Not a whole day gone, either. Something in between. He noticed a thin red abrasion like the faintest smile under the ear, no deeper than a fingernail would make if pressed with purpose, yet wrong in its position and direction. He let his eyes fall to the cuff. There was a smudge near the button, a little grayish-black that reminded him of shoe polish more than dust. He rose, still without hurry, and asked the landlady in a tone close to conversational, "You have a telephone?" "In the kitchen, Monsieur le Commissaire," she managed. "It is for emergencies." "This is one." He turned to the policeman. Downstairs. Call the doctor and the examining magistrate. Ask for a photographer. And no one in or out of the house until I say. Your name? Desforges, sir. Desforges. You will stand at the door and look at people's faces. You will not talk. If someone insists he has an urgent appointment elsewhere, you will ask him his name and not move. If he wishes to be angry, he can be angry later. Desforges saluted, relieved to be given something simple, and clattered away, too fast for the wooden stairs not to answer with each tread. Maigret drew the chair a little aside with a soft scrape and sat. The room let him. He was aware of the landlady hovering, twisting her apron. He didn't send her away. Often, the first thing people say when they are allowed to remain in a room where a body is present is not what they intended to tell a policeman at all. He paid on time, he asked. Always on the first. She answered quickly, grateful for the ordinary question. In cash. He was correct. What do you call him when you think of him? She blinked. Monsieur Dara. She pronounced it as if the name itself kept the house in order. How long? 8 months. Took the room after Christmas. He works. At a firm near the Saint-Lazare station. An import business. They have a sign with a ship on it. He leaves at 8, returns at 7. He eats here only in the mornings. In the evenings, perhaps a café, I don't know. He is quiet. Maigret glanced toward the bed. And last night? His lamp was on at 10 when I went up. I saw the strip of light under the door like now. At 6 it was still there. He did not come down for coffee. I knocked at 8. I waited. It is not in my habits to force doors, Monsieur le Commissaire. At noon I telephoned, but even then I thought, perhaps he is ill and does not wish to be seen. Did you hear anyone go in or out? She shook her head after too long a pause. The pause was not calculation. It was the house making noises inside her memory. Yesterday was Tuesday, she said, as if that explained something. On Tuesdays, the rag and bone man calls in the morning, and the laundry girl comes after lunch. In the evening, the wine shop receives a delivery. There was a crash as a crate fell. It made the dishes on my dresser dance. And around 9, no, I am not sure, the bell at the door rang once. Very soft, as if a finger had barely touched it. But when I opened it, there was no one. Children sometimes. Children ring twice, Maigret said. They are proud of the bell. She made a small, involuntary gesture with her mouth that might have been a smile if circumstances had permitted one. Who else lives on this landing? Mademoiselle Arnaud, the seamstress, at the back. She works late, and Monsieur Lemoine, a commercial traveller, but he is away. He leaves his key with me. He went to Orléans yesterday morning. Maigret looked again at the table. The ashtray held 3 cigarette ends, 2 stubbed out in the same careful way, one crushed hard, as if by a different hand. 2 of them were of the same brand. The third was a stronger tobacco, darker paper. He picked it up, turning it between finger and thumb, put it back. On the saucer near the pen lay 2 sugar lumps, still wrapped in paper, untouched. There was no cup. He stood and went to the wardrobe. 2 shirts, ironed, one fraying at the collar, hung beside a coat that had been brushed recently but not well. The lapels carried a ghostly film where the brush had missed. On the shelf, a small suitcase, and beside it, a folded square of brown paper with string, as if someone had prepared a parcel and changed their mind. A smell of soap clung to the wardrobe, the cheap laundry kind. On the floor, neatly placed side by side, were a pair of shoes, polished beyond the habit of most men who come home late in the rain. Their soles were dusty, not wet. He turned one slightly and saw the heel worn down on the outside. A man who walks a lot, but carefully. He does not stride. He levels himself. Did he go out again after 7? Maigret asked, not expecting an answer. I did not hear him go, she said, and sounded as if she would have blamed herself for having slept if sleep were an indulgence. He moved to the door and held his face near the latch. The little screws lay on the floor like seeds. The brass tongue of the chain guard hung loose. He touched the jamb and brought his finger away to find the faintest smear of something like wax or fat. He rubbed it off on his handkerchief without thinking about it, as one brushes a crumb from one's coat. Then he stooped and looked along the floorboards. A short thread of black cotton had caught where the door brushed the threshold, too short to matter, except that it shouldn't have been there. The silence began to fill again with the life of the house. A cough from the back room, a latch tested, someone shifting their weight in curiosity on a step. Maigret said, "Would you ask Mademoiselle Arnaud to wait in your kitchen, please? And anyone else who lives here who is at home. You will make coffee if you like. Make it as you always do. Monsieur Desforges will see that they go there one by one." She nodded, grateful for an action that resembled routine, and departed with little steps, her shoes complaining at each. Alone with the dead man and the lamp, Maigret lit his pipe again. The first draw was poor. He drew a second, then a third, patient with the tobacco as he was with people and rooms. He sat once more and let his eyes wander without pouncing. On the mantel, a postcard of La Rochelle propped against a glass, a small ship sketched in green ink behind the printed lines. No words on the back, only the address in a square hand, Monsieur Jules Darras, and below, Rue des Batignolles, 3rd. The stamp had not been cancelled. It had never gone to the post. A keepsake, or a thought that had not found itself into words. On the little chest of drawers, a photograph in a cheap frame faced the wall instead of the room. He did not touch it. He let the fact of its position settle in him like a weight that would find its level. The lamp buzzed faintly. He lowered his gaze and observed that the electric cord bent in a way that suggested it had been tugged, perhaps when the body slid to the floor. But the plug held. Whoever had been here had not wanted darkness. Downstairs, a door closed and voices sounded and fell. The house was filling with people not rushing, but arriving one by one, with their small lies and their small truths they preferred, like warm coats. A young, hurried tread came up the stairs and halted at the threshold. Desforges, flushed with his errand, announced more firmly than necessary that the doctor was on his way and that the magistrate had been reached and would come when he could. He looked away from the body as he spoke, as if it were impolite to look directly at misfortune while delivering news. "Good," Maigret said. "Close the door." When the younger man hesitated, he added not unkindly, "It's a room, Desforges, not a church." He waited then, not counting the minutes. He heard, or thought he heard, the small sounds of the house arranging itself. Cups set down, a chair drawn back, a woman clearing her throat and deciding what sort of story would seem reasonable to a policeman. He let the lamp's hum become part of his breath. He thought of Madame Maigret, how she would have looked at the strip of light under this door and known at once that something had gone wrong, not because of the light itself, but because it had stayed uniform, a light that never changed, had no man behind it. When the doctor arrived with his bag and tired eyes, he nodded to Maigret as one nods to a colleague in a profession that often meets in small rooms at odd hours. He crouched, touched, shook his head before speaking. Strangulation, probably with something narrow. Not long ago, not this morning either. Between 9 and midnight, I would say, but we will see. No struggle. He glanced up at the lamp as if wanting to tell it was not needed. Maigret asked nothing more. He felt the thought that had been forming in him all along declare itself without words. The man had not expected to be killed. He had expected a visit. There had been 2 cigarettes, then a stronger one. There had been a hand to the left of the ear, a small, decisive pressure, or a thin cord drawn without haste. Someone who had been in a hurry to be calm. He remembered the faint smear at the latch and the piece of thread that did not belong to anyone's hem. He thought of the bell rung softly once. He saw in his mind's eye the photograph turned toward the wall without ceremony. the way one rotates a thing to end a conversation. He stood, heavy and patient, and the floor answered to his weight as it always did. He looked a last time at the lamp and, with a gesture that was almost like touching the shoulder of a man lost in thought, he turned the shade a little so the light no longer fell directly on the face. Then he went out, closing the door behind him with care, and followed the smell of coffee down the stairs to where the house, with its starch and cabbage and worry, waited to tell him what it knew without knowing it. The kitchen had been scrubbed enough times that the smell of soap sat in the corners, but tonight the steam of coffee and a trace of boiled leek fought it. The landlady had arranged 3 cups on the table, though there were only 2 people seated. A young woman with a pale, pointed face and a heavy sweater pulled too tightly at the wrists, and a man with a salesman's haste still clinging to his mustache, though he pretended not to have it. He kept glancing at the clock by reflex, even though it was slow by 10 minutes. Desforges stood near the door, touching his cap each time anyone looked at him. The gesture had already worn a shiny circle into the brim. Maigret took off his hat and let it hang by 2 fingers. He nodded to the young woman first. "Mademoiselle Arnaud." She looked at the landlady as if asking permission to be herself, then back to him and nodded. "Yes, Monsieur le Commissaire." "And you are Monsieur Lemoine?" The man smiled politely. "Commercial traveler, soaps and household wares. I had an early train back today because a customer in Orléans had a change of heart. You know how they are." "I do," Maigret said. He sat, but not at the head of the table. He chose the side where he could see both faces and the door with the same glance. The landlady, by habit, placed the coffee at his elbow and then hovered outside the circle of chairs as if to suggest she was neither witness nor participant, but the house itself. "Mademoiselle," he said to the seamstress, "you work late." "It depends," she answered. Her voice was low, a little hoarse. "If there are deliveries to prepare. Bridesmaids' hems lately. They come all at once, these weddings, and then nothing for weeks. You hear the landing when people pass." "I hear everything," she said, and immediately looked like a child who had spoken too frankly. "The door is thin. It swells in the rain. When Monsieur Darras went out in the mornings, he always paused and pulled twice to make sure the latch took. 2 pulls, never one." "Last night?" She placed her hand palm down on the table, as if steadying it. Her fingers were pricked by little dots of blood near the nails. She had not bandaged them. Needles do that to hands, and she had learned not to mind. "I was unpicking a bodice from 9. There is a rhythm to the thread. You can feel the stitch in your fingertips. It is almost a ticking. There was the noise at the wine shop, like thunder. Before that, the bell once. Soft. I thought it was the postman being lazy. But at that hour—" She shook her head. "Then steps on the landing, not heavy. A man who places his feet by habit, not to be quiet." He paused. "I heard a voice. Not loud, then nothing. No second step. The door did not close." "The voice from inside or outside?" "Outside. Inside I didn't hear him. Sometimes Monsieur Darras coughed, the kind of cough people do when they want to show they're there. Yesterday I did not hear it. Afterwards I heard the steps go down, but it could have been someone else." "You begin to think you hear what you look for." Lemoine spread his hands, his smile tight. "I returned at about 10:30, Commissaire. The landlady was already in her room. I had my key. I saw a strip of light under the door of Monsieur Darras's room and thought nothing of it. He often read late. This morning I left early to visit the shopkeepers on my rounds. I have invoices." He patted his breast pocket, then seemed to think better of it. "I did not see anything unusual. I'm a man of routine. Ask anyone." Maigret sipped his coffee. It was not good, but it was hot, and the steam helped the room speak. "Monsieur Lemoine," he said almost idly, "your shoes are well polished." The man brightened as if complimented. "A matter of professional pride, sir. A customer looks at shoes first. My father taught me. It pays." "And you, mademoiselle?" he said, turning. "Do you smoke?" She hesitated, then gave a small, defiant nod, as if anticipating a lecture. "Sometimes, when I am anxious about a seam not lying flat. It calms my hands." He took from his pocket a scrap of folded paper and, without opening it, placed it near her cup. He did not push it toward her. He let its presence be enough. "What brand?" "Whatever is cheapest. I shouldn't. The thread stinks of it afterwards." She had not looked at the paper. She had looked at his face. "In the ashtray upstairs," he said. "There are 2 of one kind and 1 of another. Stronger, darker paper." "Gauloises," Lemoyne offered, eager to be useful. "Or maybe Boyards, though fewer smoke that now." "I don't know," the girl said. She rubbed a pinprick with her thumb. "Sometimes in the courtyard the men from the wine shop smoke those. The smell is different, thicker." The landlady made a small noise in her throat to show she could not hold it. Monsieur Darras did not like smoke. He would wave his hand as if to banish it. "Once he told me that offices are full of smoke and he came here to be quiet. He asked that I not let any of the boys sit on the stairs to smoke when it rained. I told them." They laughed. "Did he have visitors?" Maigret asked. "Rarely," the landlady said. "A man with a hat came twice, always on a Sunday just after noon. Not this past Sunday. He did not give his name, but he smelled of barber's talc, and a lady came once with a parcel in brown paper. She stayed 10 minutes. She kept her gloves on. That was months ago." "What did the man do when he visited?" She frowned. The picture, forming only now that she was asked to paint it. "He would stand very straight. He never sat fully. You know how some men sit on the edge of the chair, ready to go? Like that. When he left, he pressed the tips of his fingers on the table to push himself up. Afterwards, I had to wipe the marks. They were not dirty, only you could see them in the dust if the light came a certain way." "And last night," Maigret said to Mademoiselle Arnaud, "the steps that paused, did they go in or move on?" "I don't know. The bell had been soft, then cloth rubbing wood. You know the sound when a sleeve brushes a door. I heard that, and later, perhaps 10, perhaps later, there was a sudden quiet, the kind that makes one lift one's head." He let that rest. "Then, Monsieur Lemoyne, did you see the lamp through the keyhole when you returned?" The commercial traveler blinked, confused by the precision of the question. "No, sir. It shows under the door. I did not bend to look. Why should I?" "No reason," Maigret said. "Sometimes people are curious about light." Footsteps in the corridor foretold another arrival before the door opened. A thin man with a downturned mouth that nature had made and habit had improved stepped in without being announced. He kept his wet hat in his hand and held it as if it could offend if placed anywhere. His eyes took in the room in one flat glance and then went at once to Maigret. "Lognon," he said, as if accusing someone of a fact. He was Lognon, of course. Inspector Lognon. Gloom where the day had already been overcast. "They told me you were here. I had a burglary in Rue Nollet. Now a corpse." "The corpse waited," Maigret said. "The burglar would not have." Lognon's mouth went farther down, perhaps in acknowledgement of the logic. He hung his hat only when the landlady gestured to a peg that had seen hats of men who had long ago left the house. He poured himself coffee uninvited and drank it as if it were an apology he preferred to reject. "Doctor says strangulation. No struggle. That kind is tidy." He looked at the seamstress, at Lemoyne. They always look tidy until they don't. "Where were you last night between 8 and midnight?" he asked the room in general, as a man ticks off a routine. Maigret did not stop him. Routine has its uses. It teaches the ear the timbre of lies. Mademoiselle Arnaud answered first, quick, almost with relief. "At home, working. I do not go out at night unless the patroness calls me, and she did not." "I was on the Orléans road," Lemoyne said. at the Pension Moderne by 9. Ask Madame the proprietor. She has a register." "Registers," Lognon said, "are written in pencil." He set down his cup. "The door upstairs was chained. Landlady says no one went in. The young constable says you fiddled with screws, and then you saw a thread." "I saw a thread," Maigret said mildly. He lifted his hand to show the Otib handkerchief he had folded away. "And a trace on the jam, something to ease sliding." "Soap," Lognon said, making a face. "Or tallow. Boys' tricks. Only why the trouble? A man dies, shut the door, go downstairs. That's that. Unless someone wished it to appear that he died alone," Maigret said. "And to what end?" Lognon's voice had no curiosity, only impatience with all human aims. "To give us exercise. There are simpler ways." "The simpler ways are not always available," Maigret said. He turned to the landlady. "Madame, do you keep spare cords for parcels?" "In the drawer by the sink. It is string from the butcher. I keep it because one never knows." "Any missing?" She did not move to look. She considered, then shook her head with a decisiveness that had not been in her before. "Number Y used the last for a parcel yesterday morning for Madame Fontaine's dress. I cut a piece from the brown paper package by the wardrobe upstairs last week for a hem that needed holding. Monsieur Darras said I might. It has not been touched since. He was very orderly." "Order is often a defense," Maigret said, and stood. The chair made a small complaint on the tiles. "Mademoiselle Arnaud, may I see your room?" It was across the landing at the back, a narrow rectangle with a work table beneath the window and a bed that was more mattress than frame. Bits of thread lay everywhere like tiny veins. The air was warmer here, and the iron stood ready with water in its belly. On the table, a tiny pile of grey powder caught the light. He pressed a finger to it and brought away a smudge that smelled faintly of... He closed his eyes a second. Shoe polish. He rubbed his finger and let it go. On the sill, a small saucer served as an ashtray. 2 pale ends. No dark one. "You have visitors?" he asked without turning. "Sometimes a cousin," she said. "She brings me work from a dressmaker in the passage. Otherwise, no." "And last night?" "No one," she added, surprising herself perhaps. "I heard a man's cough once. Not from the landing, from the courtyard, as if someone had come out to breathe and then thought better of it." He nodded, lifted the corner of a piece of muslin and let it fall. He looked at the pair of shoes under her bed, cheap, the sole beginning to peel. The pins on the table had arranged themselves into a circle without intention. He went back into the corridor. Lognon was waiting with the expression of a man who has known wet feet all his life. "You will say," he offered, "that someone rang the bell softly, slipped a string through, opened the chain, went in, put the string back, and pulled the chain closed from the corridor." "I will say," Maigret answered, "that someone wanted the appearance of a man who had no visitors. People do that when their relation to the dead man is one they do not wish to declare." Lognon sniffed. "Women, then?" "Not necessarily." He turned the lamp's calculation over in his head. The warmth on the shade, the angle changed by a hand. Someone who has a habit of not sitting fully. Someone who smokes stronger tobacco when talking, then remembers himself and stubs it hard. Someone who polishes his shoes beyond reason, or who works with polish enough that it follows him like a thin shadow. "You make a novel of it," Lognon said. "The city makes the novel," Maigret said. "We only read it." He glanced back at the kitchen where Lemoine had resumed looking at the clock in small, guilty darts. "Monsieur Lemoine, your invoices." The man brightened again, brought them out, held them as if they could vouch for him. The papers smelled faintly of camphor and cupboard. The first was dated, the second countersigned by a grocer with a child's loop in his signature. It proved nothing and everything. People who lie also carry papers. "We will verify," Maigret said, and handed them back. "For now, No one leaves the house without telling Desforges where they are going. Mademoiselle Arnaud, you will continue your work. It is better when life goes on. Madame, you will give me the addresses of anyone who ever came to see Monsieur Darras. The ship sign at Saint-Lazare. We will go tomorrow." "When tomorrow?" Lognon asked, as if time owed him something and would default. "In the morning," Maigret said, and thought of Madame Maigret. The stew perhaps now cold, the table laid as an act of faith. He put his hat on at last, heavy and familiar. At the door, he paused and looked up the stairs where the line of light had been. The light was out now. The doctor had turned it off without thinking, which is what doctors do. They close eyes and lamps. On the way out, he passed the wine shop. The crates stacked against the wall held the smell of tannin and damp wood. The delivery boy wiped his hands on his apron and watched him with the open stare boys give policemen when there is nothing to be ashamed of and they wish there were. "Last night," Maigret said, "you dropped a crate." The boy grinned, then swallowed it back. "It slipped. The road was wet." "At 9? More like 1:30. The boss shouted. He shouts when he's afraid the bottles are broken and when they're not. "Did you see anyone go in or out of the house?" The boy thought, not to be helpful, but to make sure he did not invent. A man stood under the awning for a minute. He did not like the rain. He wore a hat with a small brim. He smoked. I remember because he lit a second cigarette off the first. It was the strong kind. My brother smokes them. He flicked the match in the gutter. He looked up at the windows like a person visiting, but not sure if he wishes to be expected. "What time?" 9 or just before. I had not yet been scolded. And then, "He went inside," the boy said, as if only now putting the end onto his sentence. "I think. I looked away. The boss was counting bottles like money." Maigret nodded as if at weather. He went back to the pavement, stood with his hands in his coat pockets while the mist made small beads on his hat. The lamp above the boarding-house door glowed as it had in his office earlier, a patient circle on stone. He could feel the fine tension of the thread in his mind, looped over the chain, passing under the door, pulled with care. Not a trick of boys, but of people who never had the luxury to push things open without planning first how to close them behind. He began to walk, not in a hurry, and the city came with him, wet, discreet, full of rooms where lamps had burned longer than they should. Maigret did not go far. He walked to the corner where the awning of a closed bakery held a little dry shadow for men who had forgotten their umbrellas, and stood there until the rhythm of the rain returned to its ordinary business. A taxi passed with an empty light. He did not raise his hand. He preferred to carry the room with the lamp in it a little longer, to let it rearrange itself in his head the way furniture returns to its true place when no one is watching. When he reached Boulevard Richard Lenoir, the windows of his apartment threw a softer glow than the boarding-house lamp, the kind that comes from a shade chosen by a woman who has looked at it in daylight before deciding. Madame Maigret met him with a towel that she had warmed near the stove and pressed it into his hands without comment. The stew had waited more patiently than any man could, and she set a plate before him with a firmness that allowed neither apology nor thanks to be necessary. He ate, not so much hungry as appreciative of the weight of food after the thin smell of a strange room. He told her little. He never told her much. It was a habit between them, not secrecy, but respect for the way some things are better kept in the mouth as smoke and not made into sentences. "A lamp left on," he said after a while, as if mentioning the weather. "All night." She poured him a glass of beer and sat opposite, her hands folded. "People who fear their own thoughts sleep with a lamp," she said. "People who wait for someone keep it on to show the way. You know the difference by the way the light is turned. One points to the bed, the other points to the chair. In this case," he said, "the chair." Then he was not surprised to be visited, or he wanted to be. "It's the same at the beginning." He nodded. She was looking past him at some small matter that had not been put away in the kitchen and yet did not rise to correct it. "And the chain?" he asked. She shrugged a little. "A chain is for people who do not expect anyone. But people expect and do not expect at the same time. We put the chain and then we leave the string on the chair from the parcel we opened at noon. People who live alone make little arrangements. They like tricks that spare them embarrassment. They do not like to be found open." He smiled with his eyes. "You would have made a good policeman." "I make a good wife," she said, not flattered, only stating a fact. She looked at his cuff, where the rain had darkened the cloth, and leaned forward to brush at it with her thumb. "Black," she said, making a face. "Not dirt, the kind that comes off on your fingers when you polish shoes in a hurry. It never dries properly. The girls in the passage use it to make a worn hem look new. They dab at the edge with a rag. It fools no one but the wearer, and even then only for an hour." He thought of the grey dust on Mademoiselle Arnaud's table, the smell he had not chased away. They use shoe polish for that. "When they must," she said. "They are paid for the illusion of newness more than for the stitch. If the customer sees the shine, she forgets the fray." He finished his beer and sat a little longer with her in the easy quiet that 30 years can teach two people, and then he went to bed and slept the flat sleep of a man whose thoughts, having spun, have tired themselves into stillness. He was awake early. The rain had thinned to a damp brightness that made faces look freshly washed and not necessarily better for it. He walked toward Saint-Lazare, with his hands deep in his coat pockets, the boulevard trees weeping gently into the gutters. Around the station, the city was already in a rush that pretends to be purpose. Men in cloth caps carried crates on their shoulders, as if they belonged there by birthright, and women with baskets moved at a pace that suggested they could have moved faster if anyone had deserved it. The import firm with the ship painted on its signboard had windows that looked as if they had been washed by someone who believed that glass's only virtue is not being there. Inside, the air smelled of ink, rope fiber, and oil skin. A clerk with careful hair looked up from a ledger and composed his face into the expression of a man who has decided not to be bothered. Maigret gave his name without the title. It was one of the small privileges he allowed himself, like not using his umbrella. The clerk's careful hair adjusted itself mentally to the change, and he disappeared into a back room to summon someone who would know what to do with a policeman at 8:10. The man who came out wore a waistcoat too tight at the buttons in a manner that had worn smooth with use. "Gervais," he said, offering a hand that had been washed for the purpose, but still bore a faint yellow line where tobacco lived. "You are here about Darras." Maigret inclined his head. "A reliable man," Gervais said at once, as if the phrase lived near his tongue and came when called. "Quiet. Not the kind to make trouble. Accounts petty but precise." He did not push himself forward. "We like that here." "He worked late often?" "When the end of month demands it. Otherwise 7 sharp he would put on his jacket and say good evening, as if leaving did not require more words. Last night, no later than usual. He carried nothing. He had a habit of patting his breast pocket before he left. You know the way some men do, as if to be sure their heart was still there. Then he went. "Visitors?" "In the office. We are not a cafe." Gervais smiled to show he could make a joke when required. "Once a man came. A barber, I think. He had that smell of powder that clings. He wanted to sell us shaving cream for a company gift. Ridiculous. He chatted with the lads and left a card with little scissors printed on it. I threw it away." "Sunday visits?" Gervais made a face. "We do not open on Sundays. If you mean to his lodgings, I do not keep a register of who visits my employees. I presume they have lives." "He smoke?" Maigret asked. "Never here," Gervais said. He would raise a hand when the others lit up, the kind of gesture that says, "I am not reproaching you," and reproaches all the same. He once said, not to me, to no one in particular, that smoke makes papers smell like old men. Maigret let his gaze travel over the desks, the blotters, the pencils sharpened with a knife, the stamps with dates that flipped down with a little crisp sound. On one desk a glass jar held black string. He touched it, and Gervais said, "For parcels." He raised his eyebrows as if in apology. "We did not send him any last night." "Where is his desk?" Gervais led him to a corner where the window light came with less enthusiasm. There, everything was in order to the point where human warmth had been reduced to an idea. The pen cleaned and laid parallel to the ruler, the ink bottle stoppered, a small square of blotting paper folded with a neatness that suggested he had once been told to fold things and had never found a reason to stop. In the drawer lay a packet of sugar lumps, wrapped in paper, 2 missing from the row. In the back, a postcard of La Rochelle, the same as the one Maigret had seen propped upstairs, but this one had a stamp franked and a postmark from last year. "He came from La Rochelle?" Maigret asked. "Somewhere near enough to know the harbor," Gervais said. He never spoke of it, but the way his face did not change when ships were mentioned tells more than enthusiasm. People miss only what they liked. "Any trouble lately?" Gervais' smooth manner thinned. "A small discrepancy in a client's balance," he said finally. "Not embezzlement, if that is where you go. 10 francs gone here, 10 found there." He had written a list of names and small sums as if reconciling pennies, but the names were not our clients, or at least not ours now. A private list. I told him the office is not the place for private accounts. He nodded and said it would be put in order. It's back in order now. You may look. He handed over a sheet of paper from a file, not without reluctance. Names in a square, modest hand, each with a figure beside it and a line through some, as if paid or forgiven. No regularity in the figures. They were the kind that buy a week's coal or pay for a child's medicine. The names meant nothing in themselves, except that they were the names of people who do not often sign papers. At the bottom was a note. Sunday, noon. He had underlined noon twice, as if noon were a person who needed reminding. "Who owes who?" Maigret asked, more to himself than to Gervais. "Who knows who?" Gervais corrected, and looked at the clock with the impatience of a man who has run out of sentences he is willing to give away. On his way out, Maigret paused at the door of the building next to the firm. The bracket that held a barber's pole had no pole in it. It had been removed, perhaps for painting. Inside, a thin man in a white coat swept hair into a neat pile with a brush that made no sound. The air smelled of talc and bay rum. He looked up with a reflex smile of men whose living depends on faces in mirrors. "You came once to Rue des Batignolles," Maigret said. The barber blinked, then laughed politely. "One goes many places, monsieur. Air grows everywhere. On a Sunday, just after noon." "I close Sundays," he said, then spoiled it by adding too quickly, "except for friends. But I have few friends." He swept another careful arc. "Perhaps I have been to that street. I'm a man with a bad sense of addresses. People say, the house by the wine shop, and I go where there is a smell of cork." "Your cigarettes?" Maigret asked. He looked hurt. "I do not smoke. It dulls the nose. If a barber dulls his nose, he is a butcher." "Of course," Maigret said, and left him with his hair and his careful brush. A few doors farther, a kiosk woman sold newspapers with the bored efficiency of someone who has already read all the bad news twice. He bought one to give his hands something to do and asked, as if asking the weather, "A man with a small brim hat, strong cigarettes, sometimes stands under the awning on rainy nights?" "They all do," she said. "But there is one who lights a second from the first. He is careful with his matches. He sells brushes in the afternoon. He has a suitcase with a velvet tray. He polishes shoes in front of the station sometimes if it rains and no one wants brushes. He smells of polish. He is proud of it. Why not? A smell is a profession like any other." "His name?" She shrugged. "Names do not buy papers." Then, as if deciding she no longer minded the world enough to be unhelpful, she added, "He calls himself Victor. Or perhaps that is only what he says when someone calls him something he dislikes. You know the type." He did. Men who live by small conversations and the shine they put on others' things. A man like that has the patience to ease a chain open from outside and the habit of leaving black on cuffs without meaning to. He would smoke the stronger cigarettes because he can bargain for them cheaply. He would ring a bell softly because he knows he is not welcome anywhere he is not already known. Back at the quay, a thin envelope waited on his desk with the doctor's neat writing in it, confirming what the touch of the dead man's skin had already told him. He read it and put it aside. Desforges appeared in the doorway with the urgent expression of a man who has learned that his urgency does not travel. "The wine shop boy," he said. He remembered something else. The man with the small brim, he said, had a brush handle sticking from his pocket, the kind that looks like a tail. He laughed. He said the man turned it in his fingers when he was thinking. "Bring him," Maigret said. "Not the man, the boy. Boys tell the truth about things they laugh at." When the boy arrived, still smelling of tannin and youth, he stood uncertainly close to the door as if escape were the natural end of every errand. "It was nothing," he said at once, guilty at having something. Only when the man went in, he kept his hand in his pocket and his other on the door, but not on the knob, on the wood. He pressed it like a person who doesn't like pushing with the palm. "Because of Polish," Maigret said. The boy's eyes lit the way they do when a teacher shows the trick of a problem and the sum appears by itself. "And when he came out?" "I didn't see him come out," the boy said. "It was later and I was in the back, but the crate I dropped..." He looked as if he had betrayed someone. "It wasn't so heavy. It slipped because my hands were wet." "Your hands were wet," Maigret said, as if filing it under weather, and let the boy go. He sat then and let the parts of the evening fall again into the shape they had begun to take. A man who waited, a visitor who smoked a stronger cigarette and did not sit fully, a seamstress who knew the trick of making old things look new with blacking, a commercial traveler who polished his shoes to a shine like a conscience, a photograph turned to the wall, a list of names worth the price of coal. He felt neither triumph nor impatience, only that faint tightening in the chest that says a line has been found and, if one holds it taut, someone at the other end will eventually lose the strength to keep holding. He reached for his pipe, packed it carefully, and as he struck the match, he thought of Madame Maigret's remark. People who wait for someone point the light at the chair. Somewhere there was a chair with a man's fingerprints pressed into the dust because he had not fully sat, and a hand that had come from behind the head to close the breath with the small, neat force of those who know the value of pressure applied in the right place. He blew out the match and watched the smoke rise and thin and become part of the ordinary air, which, as always, held more stories than anyone cared to breathe. The pipe drew well that morning, its smoke circling slowly above his desk while the city outside took on the grey resolve of a working day. Files thumped in corridors, phones rattled with their urgent inconsequence, but Maigret remained still, letting the fragments of the night settle inside him. There was no hurry. He had learned that impatience clouds the water just when the shapes beneath are ready to reveal themselves. He thought of Victor, if that was his name. The brush seller with his pockets smelling of polish, the kind of man who lives on the edge of things, known by sight to kiosks and cafe keepers, but rarely invited into anyone's rooms. Men like that could enter lives softly, like the bell rung without force, and leave with no one sure they had ever been there at all. A knock came, not sharp but insistent enough, and Desforges appeared again, his youth still unsoftened by habit. He held out a slip of paper. "From the registry office, sir. About Darras. He was born in La Rochelle, as you thought. Unmarried, no children, no criminal record. Parents deceased. He had a brother once, but the record says he left for North Africa years ago. Nothing more." Maigret nodded, folded the paper and slid it under the ashtray. A brother in North Africa was like a shadow behind a curtain, something that might stir if the wind rose. But for now, the house in Batignolles held the tighter air. He asked Desforges to bring the seamstress to the quay. It was not an order, but a suggestion, though in the young man's ears it became a mission. When Mademoiselle Arnaud arrived, she sat carefully on the edge of the chair, her hands in her lap as if she had rehearsed their stillness. The nervous energy of her small body betrayed her more than her words. She looked at the smoke above his pipe as if it might cloud the questions too. You heard the steps, the voice, the brush of cloth against the door, he reminded her gently. She nodded. Yes, Monsieur le Commissaire. And you sew for women who sometimes prefer their dresses appear newer than they are. Her mouth twitched, then steadied. All of us do. We are asked to perform miracles for the price of bread. He leaned forward a little. And sometimes a bit of polish helps. A trick with a rag on a hem. Her eyes darted up, sharp with surprise. Madame Maigret told you. Madame Maigret notices things, he said with a faint smile. As do you. Now, these names in the notebook. Did he ever mention them? They are not clients of your dressmaker? She looked at her hands, then shook her head. I do not know them. She paused, then added, but he was a man who kept accounts of things no one else would bother with. Once he asked if I knew a woman named Berthaud who lived on Rue des Moines. I said no. He said it was nothing, but he wrote her name on a scrap of paper and put it away. He had the air of someone balancing debts no one had given him to collect. She grew more agitated, words spilling as if to justify her presence in the story. He was not unkind, but he had a way of looking at you as if he knew what you owed. To life, to yourself, to others. People do not like that. Maigret let silence follow, and she filled it with breath, not more words. He studied her small shoes, worn thin, and thought of the string on the door, the soft bell. She was too frightened for invention. If she lied, it was not to mislead him, but to protect herself from the truth brushing too near. He released her gently, telling Desforges to escort her back. When she had gone, Lognon entered with his perpetual air of bad weather. He dropped a file on the desk as if it had offended him. The brush seller, he said. Victor, or whatever he calls himself. He has no fixed address. He sleeps sometimes at a lodging house in Rue de Clichy, sometimes nowhere at all. Petty arrests for vagrancy, nothing serious. He polishes shoes outside cafes and sells brushes that fall apart after a week. He owes money everywhere and pays with smiles. People tolerate him the way they tolerate pigeons. He is not a man who kills, Maigret. He is a man who disappears when a bill comes. Maigret puffed and let the words hang. And yet, he said, the room smelled faintly of him. The cuff of Darras carried his shadow. Lognon grimaced. You can smell ghosts if you want to, but perhaps your man with tidy accounts kept company with worse than a brush seller. There are names on that list. Look here. He jabbed at the paper. 2 of them live near Rue Lepic. They have been in trouble before for small frauds. Selling insurance that does not exist. Collecting rents for rooms already rented. Nothing worth prison, but worth suspicion? Why not think he tangled with them? Perhaps, Maigret said. But suspicion is like smoke. It spreads until you can see nothing clearly. Better to let the smoke thin. Lognon snorted. And while we wait, men like Victor vanish into alleys. Men like Victor, Maigret said, always come back to the same corner. They are like cats. Their paws know the way. By late afternoon, rain threatened again. Maigret walked alone toward Rue de Clichy, past the cafes with their awnings sagging under damp air. At the lodging house, the concierge knew him by sight, as all concierges know policemen, and pointed up the stairs without needing questions. Victor, she said, owes me for 3 nights. He owes everyone, but he comes back when he's hungry. He thinks charm can be currency. The room she indicated was bare, a cot with a grey blanket, a table scarred by knives. On the table lay a half-empty tin of polish. its lid stuck by dried black paste. The air reeked of it. There were cigarette ends in a cracked saucer, darker paper, crushed hard. He touched one, comparing it in his mind to the stub from the ashtray in Darris's room. Same strength, same careless force in the crushing. The thread between the rooms grew tighter. Victor was not there, but in the drawer. Maigret found a folded scrap of paper with names written clumsily. 2 matched the list in Darris's notebook. Next to them was a figure circled twice. Beside the figure, a word. Noon. He pocketed it without a word and went back down. The concierge shrugged when he asked if she had seen him. This morning, early. He said he was going to polish the city. She laughed at her own phrase, though it was only Victor's. He will be on a corner where men come from trains, because that is where shoes are dirtiest. At Saint-Lazare again, amid the shuffle of passengers and the hiss of steam, Maigret spotted him soon enough. Victor had set up near a wall, a small crate before him, his brushes spread like tools of a trade he believed noble. He was talking, always talking, his hands moving like birds. A man with a suitcase bent reluctantly and let him brush at his shoes. When the man left, Victor lit a cigarette from the stub of the last, the gesture fluid, practiced. Maigret walked up without hurry and stood until Victor noticed him. The brush seller's eyes flickered with recognition and calculation, but his smile came easily. Monsieur le commissaire, you need a shine. Your shoes are honest, but honest shoes sometimes like a little music. Not today, Maigret said, but you will walk with me. Victor spread his hands. Always ready for a promenade if the company is agreeable. He slipped the brushes into his pockets and followed, his steps light, as if he could dart away at any moment. But he did not. They walked side by side down the damp street. Maigret said nothing at first, letting the silence do its work. Victor tried twice to begin a story, then let it drop. Finally, he sighed. You think I was in the Batignolles' house? People see me everywhere. I'm a man of corners. One corner is like another. Yet you rang the bell softly, Maigret said. You smoked the strong kind. You sat without sitting, pressing your fingers on the table to rise. You left polish where it had no place. Victor's smile wavered. People remember things they want to remember. The boy at the wine shop watches everyone. He wants stories to tell. The seamstress hears steps and makes them into ghosts. And if I did visit, what of it? Darris was a man who kept accounts. He lent a franc to a man who needed wine. He wrote it down. He lent a meal to a girl who was cold. He wrote it down. Who can live like that, always writing, never forgetting? And you owed him? Maigret asked. Victor laughed softly. Me? I owe everyone. I pay with talk, but Darris, he did not take talk. He wanted francs, even if they were small. He had his list. I told him lists are for grocers, not for men. He said one day the account must balance. He looked at me like a priest, as if I had sins, not debts. That is worse. Maigret stopped walking. The drizzle had thickened, the lamps coming on one by one with their sleepy glow. He looked at Victor's narrow shoulders, his hands stained with black despite his efforts. And so? He asked quietly. Victor shrugged, but his voice had lost its ease. And so, I left. What else? If he is dead, it is not my hand. I have no strength for that. I polish. I talk. Others have stronger hands. Maigret let him go for now. He watched Victor vanish into the wet evening, his brushes clinking faintly in his pocket. There was no need to arrest him yet. Men like Victor circle back. They cannot help it. The truth was not in the strength of his hands, but in the debts that clung to Darris like shadows. Someone who had seen the list, someone who could not bear to be remembered in ink, had closed his breath with quiet precision. Back at the quay, Maigret stood by the window and watched the rain collect in the lamplight. He thought of the names, the debts, the photograph turned to the wall, the seamstress with her pricked fingers, the salesman polishing his conscience, the barber with his careful brush. Ordinary people, each carrying a burden too small to call crime, too large to carry in silence. In such rooms, murder did not roar, it whispered, and he knew that in the whisper lay the answer, waiting for him to listen long enough. The rain that evening turned heavier, as if the city wished to rinse itself clean of all the small lies whispered in its courtyards. From the window of his office, Maigret watched the droplets gather into streams, sliding down the glass in crooked paths, dissolving the blurred lights of the embankment. He drew steadily on his pipe, his thoughts circling Victor's words. The brush seller had protested too much, but not with the desperation of guilt. His evasions were the kind of smokescreen a man without real shelter always carried with him. He feared prison, yes, but more than that, he feared being fixed in one place where his stories could no longer shield him. And yet, something in his tone when speaking of Darras had been too sharp, as though the dead man's habit of writing down small debts had pressed on him like a thumb to a bruise. The sheet of names lay on his desk. He read them one by one, letting their sound sink into his ear, measuring them against the city he knew. A man on Rue Lepic, another on Rue des Moines, a woman whose address had faded from memory. They were not criminals of the sort to trouble the prefecture. They were the kind who lived one door away from eviction, who bought coal by the sack and wine by the half-bottle, who feared nothing so much as being remembered by name when they had not paid. Darras, precise, orderly, correct, had remembered them all. A knock came. Lognon stepped in, dripping and displeased, holding his hat like an enemy. "The magistrate wants to know why you are wasting time with brush sellers," he said flatly. "He says it is a simple case of a man strangled by some low fellow for money. The petty cash box in his room had 20 francs missing. Isn't that enough?" Maigret exhaled a long plume of smoke. "Is it?" he asked. Lognon frowned. "You always want storms where there is rain enough already. 20 francs and a dead man. What more?" 20 francs, Maigret said, and a lamp left on all night pointing at a chair. A chain fastened from inside, though the visitor had left. A photograph turned to the wall, and a list of names that meant something to him, though perhaps not to us. A man does not die only because of francs. Lognon muttered something inaudible and left, leaving behind the smell of wet wool. The office grew quiet again. Maigret stayed late, walking the room in slow circles, the paper of names folded in his hand. He thought of Madame Maigret's remark. People who keep lamps on wait for someone. If Darras had waited, it was not for Victor, not really. Victor was too obvious, too ready to be suspected. Someone else had stood in that room, pressing fingertips into the dust of the table, not sitting fully, not daring to leave their mark except in absence. Someone Darras had expected and feared just enough to fasten the chain, but not enough to turn off the lamp. The following morning, when the air smelled washed but not clean, he walked again to the Batignolles house. The landlady received him with the exhausted deference of someone who has been living for 2 days among whispers of tragedy. She led him upstairs without being asked, her apron twisted into a rope in her hands. The room had been left much as it was, except the body was gone, the bed stripped, the lamp cold. On the table, the blotter with its dried ink still lay. The photograph still faced the wall. He picked it up this time. A woman looked back at him from the cheap frame, middle-aged, unsmiling, her hair pulled tight. Not beautiful, not even inviting, but her gaze steady, her lips pressed as if they had learned to keep words locked. On the back, in neat, square letters, the name Claire, and nothing more. He asked the landlady who she was. The woman shook her head quickly, saying she had never seen the face before. It had been there from the beginning, she said, and she had not touched it. He set the photograph back, this time facing outward. "Claire," he repeated softly, as though the name might walk into the room if spoken enough. Downstairs, he asked the seamstress to join him again. She came with her work still in her hands, a hem dangling from her lap, needles gleaming like little swords. She looked at the photograph when he showed it to her, and for a fraction of a second her breath caught. She said she did not know the woman, but the denial came too fast, too brittle. He let it go, only nodding. Instead, he asked her about the cough she had heard from the courtyard. She frowned, trying to recall. "A single cough," she said. "Not a smoker's cough. A man clearing his throat the way one does before speaking but then does not." "And after?" "Nothing," she said. It stopped. I thought perhaps it was Monsieur Lemoine, but he was not there, he told you. He left her then, returning to the kitchen where Lemoine himself had just arrived. The commercial traveler removed his gloves with exaggerated neatness, his shoes polished to an almost unnatural gleam. He had invoices to show again, papers that spoke for him better than he could. But Maigret asked him something else entirely. "You travel often," he said. "You know how to leave bills unpaid in one town while presenting a face of credit in another. Do you keep accounts as precise as Darras did?" Lemoine looked startled, then forced a smile. "I sell soap, commissaire, not numbers. My accounts are in the order book." "And yet," Maigret said, his eyes on the man's immaculate shoes, "your name was on his list, with 10 francs beside it." The man paled. "Everyone owes 10 francs somewhere. If he wrote it down, it was a loan for a meal, perhaps, nothing more, a friend's courtesy." "You considered him a friend?" "A neighbor, nothing else." His voice had become brittle, the smile frozen. Maigret did not press further. He let silence sit between them until the man shifted uneasily and found an excuse to leave. The silence had said enough. Lemoine's presence in the story was not incidental. Whether guilt or shame, something tied him to that list and to Darras's last evening. By afternoon, Maigret returned to the quay. On his desk, he laid the 2 sheets side by side, the list from Darras's desk and the scrap found in Victor's room. 2 names appeared on both, one of them Lemoine's. The other was Claire. The figure beside her name was larger than the others. He sat for a long time, pipe forgotten, staring at the 2 pages, the photograph in the frame, the name written by Darras's careful hand, the debts that were not money but something heavier. It was not a case of francs. It was a case of memory. Darras had been a man who did not allow debts to vanish, and someone too fragile to bear being remembered, had tried to erase themselves in the only way possible, by erasing him. In the evening, he walked once more to Batignolles, the mist curling around the lamps like breath. The wine-shop boy was stacking bottles again, his hands quick, his eyes watchful. Maigret asked him if he had ever seen a woman visit Darras. The boy thought, shrugged, then said, "A woman once, yes. She wore gloves. She did not stay long. She had the look of someone who comes not to see, but to be seen. I remember because she left quickly, and the man's lamp was still on when she was gone." "Her name?" "I don't know names," the boy said, "but she had eyes like knives. You don't forget eyes like that." The drizzle thickened, and Maigret pulled his coat close. The circle was tightening. The photograph, the name, the figure on the list, the woman with gloves, the neighbor with polished shoes, the brush seller who hovered like smoke. Ordinary people, each weighed down by small debts, each hiding behind routine. Somewhere among them was the hand that had pressed quietly beneath the ending the man who remembered too much. He turned toward home, his steps steady. Madame Maigret would be waiting, and over supper he would tell her little, but he knew she would sense it anyway. The case was no longer a matter of 20 francs stolen, nor of Victor's shadow on a cuff. It was about memory, about a man who insisted on keeping account of debts others wished forgotten. And Maigret, with his patient silences, would wait until the one who had carried the weight too long finally allowed it to break them open. By morning, the rain had thinned to a damp grey breath that clung to stone and made the metal railings sweat. Maigret walked without haste toward Rue des Moines, following a line that had drawn itself quietly across his thoughts during the night. The name the seamstress had mentioned without meaning to. The photograph turned to the wall, the larger figure on the list beside Claire. It was not a policeman's line, marked with arrows and times, but something older, the path people wear between rooms when they think they are walking at random. Rue des Moines lay under a sky that could not decide whether to brighten. There were little shops with letters burned into their windows by years of sun, cobblers and watchmen of clocks, and between them the new places that pretend too hard not to be temporary. Halfway down the street, a brass plate said Berthaud, Retouches et Mode. The paint on the door was careful, the kind of carefulness that does not come from money but from pride. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of steam and starch. Two girls bent over machines. Their feet worked the pedals and the needles made their quick insect hum. A bell rang softly when the door closed, a polite bell, no more. At a table toward the back, a woman in a dark dress was pinning a collar onto a mannequin torso with fingers that were quick and exact. Her hair was pulled tight. She did not look up at once. It was a way of saying she was busy in a place where being busy is the only defense one has. "Madame Berthaud," he said. She lifted her head and measured him with a glance that did not admit surprise. Her eyes were not large, but the look of them was steady in a way that made people tell the truth to themselves whether they wished to or not. She did not offer her hand. "What can I do for you?" "I am looking for a woman named Claire," Maigret said, as if asking for a spool of thread. He watched the faintest change in her face, not quite a flinch. "There are many Claires," she answered evenly. "It is a name for girls who do not want to be noticed and are. I am Madame Berthaud." "Claire," he said again, touching the frame of his spectacles, which he didn't wear, and her eyes dropped, only to the pins, but they dropped. "A man on Rue des Batignolles kept your photograph turned to the wall." She stood as if to straighten the mannequin, though it already stood straight. "People keep many things. Photographs, receipts, grudges." She glanced at the girls. "Take 10 minutes, she told them without turning her head. The hum ceased. The girls pushed back their chairs and went into the little room behind, their chatter staying behind their lips. They had sense. When they were gone, she moved to a table near the window, where a length of brown paper lay with string curled on it like a pale worm. She pulled the string straight with her fingers and tied it back into a neat circle. Her hands were precise. They did not waste movement. "If he had my photograph," she said, "it is because he asked for it. He was a man who liked things to have labels." "You knew him well enough to have a story about him," Maigret said mildly. "Most people do not have stories about men who sell brushes." "He did not sell brushes," she said with the first trace of heat. "He sold order." "And you preferred disorder?" She looked at him fully then. "I preferred not to be written down by someone else's hand." He nodded as if consenting to a truth she had placed between them. He took the photograph of her from his pocket, not the one from the room. He had had a copy made, held it by the corner without offering it. "You visited him once," he said. "You wore gloves. The boy from the wine shop remembers you because boys remember eyes that could cut cloth. You stayed 10 minutes. You had the look of someone who came not to see, but to be seen." Her mouth pressed itself into a smaller line. "If I went," she said, "it was to tell him not to come here again. He was a man who believes in noon." She said the word as if it were a person with habits. Sundays he would stand across from the church not attending, and he would watch who came out. He would stand at noon as if the clock belonged to him. "He wrote noon beside your name," Maigret said. She gave a small, controlled shrug. "He would. He wrote everything." "And the figure beside it?" The figure, she said, with the care of a dressmaker when she cuts close to a seam so as not to spoil the cloth, was not for money. She glanced at the brown paper, the string. He lent me nothing I couldn't have repaid in francs. He waited. Silence here did not feel like waiting. It was like letting a garment hang to let its own weight find the right line. She picked up the string circle again and untied it with her thumb and 2 fingers, doing it so quickly it hardly seemed a knot had existed. She tied it once more. I had a daughter, she said then, very flatly, before I had a husband, in La Rochelle, when I was young enough to think that rain stops when one wills it. The child died before she had a name that stayed. He, Darius, knew. He was a boy who kept accounts even then. He thought memory was piety. He thought reminding me was charity. She looked at him as if she could see the next question forming and did not intend to let it. He came to Paris later as if the railway carried justice in its wagons. He would stand at my door and speak of debt, not money, the kind that cannot be paid. "And you told him not to come," Maigret said very softly. "I told him I had a life," she said. "I told him there were girls who needed to eat on what I made from other people's hems. I told him I did not need a man to count my shame like buttons." The words had come without a tremor, but when they were done, her hands lay flat on the paper as if otherwise they would fly. There was no melodrama in her. It was the quiet that exhausted. He had seen it before, the way some women used stillness like a wall. "The evening he died," he said, and there was no inflection. "Did you go?" She did not move. "I am not a woman who goes out in the rain to visit men." "Even when they keep your photograph turned to the wall?" Her eyes flickered, not at the photograph, but at the memory of it turned away. He had expected anger. What came was something like baffled sorrow. "He put it face down once," she said, "when I went to tell him to stop. I turned it back, not out of pride, because it is dangerous to let people think a face cannot look." She lifted her chin a little. "I did not go that night." "When did you last see Monsieur Lemoine?" he asked abruptly, and watched the effect. There it was, the very small drawing in a breath. Not guilt, a calculation one makes in a fraction to decide if a name is a ditch to step over or a river. "He buys thread now and then," she said. "He sells soaps, and women who sew need soap to clean what others have soiled. And he owed 10 francs to Darius. Who does not owe 10 francs to someone?" She had the sentence ready, like a hem already ironed. "If you wish to do your work, commissaire, do it. Do not make me help you embroider it." He did not smile. He asked to borrow a length of string. She cut it, not too generous. He slipped it into his pocket. "You could open a chain from the outside with this," he said, as if asking about a stitch. She looked at him with the flat patience of someone who has had men underestimate her hands. "With anything, if you have learned not to push doors with your palms," she said. "A dressmaker spoils her work if she touches it with the wrong part of her hand. But do not make tricks into guilt. Tricks are what poor people learn to keep from being made ashamed." He stood. The girls in the back room made a small noise as they pretended not to have listened. "I may ask you to come to the quay," he said. "You may," she said. She had not conceded. She had only allowed that she would cross a room if invited. On the street again, the day had brightened a degree, enough to make the puddles look less like holes and more like glass. He stopped at a tobacco shop and bought the strong cigarettes. The woman behind the counter smelled of anise and knew how to mind her business. He broke one in two for the weight of it in his fingers and thought of the ends in the ashtray on the table by the lamp. He lit one and then, with a small grimace, pinched it out and dropped it in his pocket. It was not his taste, and he did not want its smell to follow him home. At the boarding house again, the landlady had set her face into a mask of solemn helpfulness. She led him up without being asked. The room had become a place where the story of a man had burned out and left only marks. He went to the table and placed the strong cigarette beside the two pale stubs and the crushed dark one. It did not teach him anything he had not known, but the sight of them together said, 3 voices had spoken in this room, and one had fallen silent. He picked up the photograph again, and this time he set it at the exact angle the dust had kept clean. It faced the chair. He sat and let the room climb back into him. There was a film on the lampshade at the edge where a hand had turned it. The electric cord had a small kink in it too near the plug, the kind that comes from being pulled after someone has fallen, a reflex to catch the light before darkness has time to arrive. He felt the slow, certain movement of a thing taking shape where there had been only outlines. Claire had not needed francs from Darras. She had needed him to stop being the man he was. Lemoine owed small money, not the kind that kills, but he had the habit of appearing where women kept order. Victor hovered like Polish on cuffs, leaving marks where he had been but never owning any of them. And somewhere outside the door a man had coughed once and not come in. He went downstairs and crossed to the wine shop. The boy looked up, hopeful for news that would make his part bigger. "The woman with the gloves," Maigret said. "When did she come?" "Months ago," the boy said, "when it was still cold. She looked at the door as if it were a mirror." He thought, pleased with the sentence he had made. "Last night there was no woman, only the man with the small brim." "And someone else," Maigret said. "Someone who does not smoke and who coughs once to test the air. Someone who does not like to be seen entering a room he has no right to. If he did not come in, he waited for someone who did." The boy blinked as if trying to see the person inside air. "The commercial traveller," he said suddenly, startled at his own thought. "He waited once for the post, near the lamp-post. He coughs like that, to say he is there without asking to be spoken to." He looked almost apologetic for having said something that could be true. Maigret nodded and left him with his bottles. He did not go to find Lemoine at once. He walked instead across to the little square where damp benches waited for men who haven't yet learned they will get cold. He sat and took out the piece of string Claire had cut. He looped it in his fingers absent-mindedly, as if making a cat's cradle. He passed it over his thumb the way a hand might pass a thread over a latch. The trick was nothing. It existed because some people live behind doors they can neither leave open nor close completely. He thought of Madame Maigret's remark about lamps pointing to chairs. He thought of the photograph turned to the wall and then turned back by a woman who did not wish to erase her own face. When he rose, it was with the heaviness he always felt, when the thing he sought was no longer a fact but a person. Back at the quay, he sent for Lemoine, not because he expected a confession, but because a man who polishes his shoes at night will come when the police ask. They fear disorder more than guilt. He asked also that Madame Berthaud be invited, at her convenience, for a conversation without pins, and he sent a constable to wander Saint-Lazare at noon on Sunday to stand where a man might stand if he believed the clock belonged to him. He lit his pipe and waited, the smoke rising like a patient thought. Outside, the rain had stopped pretending to change the city. It was only on its surface. Inside, the names on the 2 lists lay side by side, as stubborn as people. He smoothed the sheets with his palm and looked at the figure beside Claire. He had written beside it now in his own square hand, not francs. It was not insight so much as acceptance. The trouble with cases like this was not finding the hand that tightened on a throat. It was understanding the hand had tightened to stop a voice that insisted on speaking a name aloud at noon. And there is always someone in Paris who cannot bear to be spoken of by the wrong mouth. Lemoine arrived first, as Maigret had expected, a quarter of an hour early and with a politeness that made the clerk at the quay stand up straighter than he did for most men. He had changed his tie. His shoes shone with a new coat of care, and his mustache had been trimmed as if truth might be found along its edge. He held his hat with both hands, turning it a little, then stilling it when he realized the movement betrayed him. Maigret did not ask him to sit at once. He let him occupy the doorway the way men who are not guilty but afraid of shame do. their bodies ready to pivot either toward explanation or escape. When he did gesture to the chair, he chose the one a little too low. It always made the visitor decide whether to commit to sitting or hover above it. Lemoine hovered. "I came," he said, "because you sent word. A man must not make a policeman wait." "You waited last night," Maigret said, almost as if to himself. "On the landing or near the door, you coughed once." A small pulse moved in the side of Lemoine's neck. "I have a tickle when it is damp," he said quickly. "Everyone coughs. The wine boy coughs all day." "Did you go in?" "No." He lifted his chin a little. "I am a man who does not open doors that are not mine. I waited for a letter I expected. The post is irregular. I thought perhaps it might be left with the landlady. When it was not, I went to my bed." "You expect letters at night?" "Sometimes a customer writes late," he said. He met Maigret's eyes with the look of a man who knows the answer is poor, but prefers it to any better truth he does not have at hand. Maigret pushed the two papers across the desk, the neat list from Darris's desk and the clumsier scrap from Victor's drawer. He didn't speak. Lemoine's gaze fell on the figures the way a sparrow falls on a crust and then startles at its own hunger. "Your name is on both," Maigret said mildly. 10 francs, and next to another, a larger number, a woman's name. "Claire." "I owed him," Lemoine answered, almost relieved to have a declarative sentence. "Once, when I was short after a long trip and a customer delayed payment," he offered. He wrote it down as if I were a boy taking sweets. I paid him back. He kept the paper. He kept all papers. "And Claire?" He hesitated, and in the small delay something in him softened, as if he had reached the place where pretending fatigues more than telling. "She is a respectable woman," he said quietly. "She works. She has more courage in her hands than most men have in their backs. He went to see her when he had no right to. He liked to stand across from the church on Sunday and watch the women come out as if their faces belonged to his memory. A man like that ruins lives without touching them. That is what I think." "You were protecting her?" "I'm not a man who fights," he said. And it was true. I wished only to tell him to leave her in peace, to take his lists and go stand at another door. "How did you plan to say it?" He made a helpless motion with the hat. "Gently. That is how one says hard things. But I did not go in. The chain was fastened." "You could have opened it," Maigret said, laying a length of string on the desk. Lemoine looked at it and then at his hands, clean, smelling faintly of soap. "I do not know tricks," he said, almost with pride. "I travel. There are enough tricks at stations. I do not make them with cords in corridors." "You saw who went in," Maigret said. A flush rose and fell. "A man with a small brim. I know him by sight. He polishes shoes sometimes at Saint-Lazare. He is always around, like smoke. He rang the bell and stood too close to the door. He has the look of someone who believes doors will forgive him. He did not stay long. And after, I left," he said too quickly, then slower, as if repeating the fact to make it truer. "I left." Maigret let that rest. "You may go for now," he said. "Do not travel." "I have roots," Lemoine protested softly. "If I do not go, the grocers will buy elsewhere." "They will buy elsewhere for a day," Maigret said. "Not for a lifetime." When Lemoine had gone, the office held his trace for a moment. The scent of polish that comes not from tins but from cloth, brushed every night. The faint dryness of a man who does not smoke and therefore smells of nothing in particular. Madame Berthaud came later, not early and not late, as if arriving on time were an act of independence. She wore the same dark dress. Her hair was pinned the same way. She did not smooth her skirt before she sat, the way some women do to buy time. She did not need time. Maigret placed the photograph on the table, face up. He put the list beside it, a small edge of one sheet inside the other, as if they were garments to be matched. She looked at neither. She looked at him. "You have your hands full of people who think they know what I am," she said without heat. "I am tired of being known." "Then let me ask about what you are not," Maigret said. "You're not a woman who goes out in the rain to men. You're not a woman who takes francs she cannot return. You are not a woman who leaves knots clumsy." At that, the corner of her mouth twitched, not amusement, not approval, recognition that he had understood something that did not need to be explained. "No," she said, "I do not leave knots clumsy." "He came to you Sundays at noon," Maigret said. "He stood where he could see the door of the church and your window. He did not go in because noon is for those who belong. He wanted to be the bell without entering the building. He wanted to be time," she said softly. "He wanted to be the clock for everyone else. You went to him once with gloves." "I was foolish," she said, and there was no self-reproach in it, only the evenness of a seam laid flat. "I thought one can tell a man to stop, and he will stop. I thought he had come to Paris to forget the girl I was. He had come to memorize her. On the night he died, you did not go." She held his eyes. "I did not go. You know who did?" She lifted her hand and let it fall. "Do you think women know the steps of all the men who wait for them? We learn to hear danger. We do not learn to hear everything." He nodded. He slid the length of string across the table with 2 fingers. "Can you show me how you would open a chain without entering?" She looked at the door of the office, at the chain that hung there in daylight like a dog's leash in a kind house. "You pass it over the knob," she said, not moving. "You fish it along the jamb until the tongue catches, and you pull. If your hands have done buttonholes all your life, you do not think about it. But, commissaire, tricks are not crimes. Men make crimes with reasons, not with string. And what reason would a man carry who rings a bell softly once?" She inhaled and, for the first time, looked at the photograph. He would carry fear of being remembered. He would carry the wish to erase a name he could not pay. "Your name," he said. She shook her head. "Not mine. Mine is sewn on my door. It is the ones who are ashamed of theirs who want to pull the thread until the cloth comes undone." He asked her to wait in the corridor. He sent Desforges to fetch Victor, who was found, as promised, orbiting Saint-Lazare like a small moon. The brush seller came with the air of a man who wants to make a joke and senses the joke will not be permitted. He glanced at the strong cigarettes on the desk and then away, as if denying an intimacy before it was offered. "You were at Rue des Batignolles," Maigret said without preface. "A man goes where the rain drives him," Victor said with his old smile. Smaller now. "I go where shoes are dirty." "You rang. You went in. You smoked the dark one. You sat without sitting." "I do not sit," he said, and it was true. "Chairs do not like me." "What did he say to you?" Victor looked at the window as if the rain might have words he could borrow. He said, "Sunday, noon." He said, "Tell her not to hide." He said, "Names are not curses." He spoke like a priest who had forgotten he was a boy once. He scuffed a shoe against the floor and stopped at once, ashamed of the mark. I told him he should not write things in ink. Ink does not forgive. And then, Victor's hands made the gesture of a man who avoids all hard descriptions. I left. I am clever at leaving. Who came after you? He closed his eyes as if to bring back the doorway. A man who coughed, not old but tidy. The kind who ties his tie in a mirror that is too small. He stood and did not move. I passed him on the stairs and he looked at my hands as if they had something on them that would rub off. And later? Victor spread his fingers. Later is for others. I had a corner to find. Maigret sent him away as he had sent the others, with the soft order that holds. Then he sat a moment, alone with the 3 different airs they had brought into the room. The starch and steam of a shop, the clean blank of a salesman's quarters, the thin tang of polish that clung to men who live by shine. Longyon stepped in again without knocking, as if the door had failed to resist him. "You are mixing cloth and soap and string," he said. "You will end by knitting a scarf." "And if the scarf keeps a neck warm, it has a use," Maigret said. "Tell the magistrate I will take him his thief when I have found his man. Until then he may count 20 francs. Longyon made the face of a man who has never owned a scarf and left. The quay quieted. In the hallway, the sounds of the building, typing, a chair dragged, a throat cleared, fell into their habitual places. Maigret looked at the clock. Noon was 2 days away. He called Desforges and told him not just to stand at Saint-Lazare on Sunday, but to stand inside the church for once, to face the door as the congregation came, out to see who believes the bell speaks personally to them and who cannot bear the sound. He took the photograph in his hand and turned it over once more. "Claire," the back said, square and uncompromising. He set it back in the frame and placed the frame beside the 2 lists so that the 3 of them touched. It pleased him, the way some arrangements of objects calm a room. He thought of Madame Maigret's in their kitchen, her remark about lamps pointing at chairs, then lodged in him with all the other small truths she had slipped into his work without ever calling them that. He left the office before dark and walked to Rue des Batignolles. The landlady let him in with the respect that had acquired a little familiarity, the kind that says a house has decided a man has the right to come and go. He went up alone to the room. The lamp stood where it had been, innocent now, a machine that had been made complicit. He sat in the chair and set the string along the edge of the table. The electric cord still kinked stubbornly. He could see the hand reaching for it in reflex, not wanting darkness to surprise him even at the end. In the quiet, he practiced the chain trick without opening the door, passing the string along the jamb, catching the tongue, feeling the small resistance give. It took him 3 tries. On the 3rd, the chain slid softly into place with a little click that a person on the landing would have taken for ordinary life. He stood in the circle of the lamp and imagined the 3 cigarettes speaking, each in its way, the pale ones making short, nervous ash, the dark one crushed as if told to be silent fast. He imagined the cough on the landing, the man who could not bear to go in and yet could not go away, the woman who would not be written by another's hand, the shadow who passes in and out of rooms like weather. None of them were villains. None of them were heroes. They were the city. And Darras, he had wanted to be time. People forgive thieves more readily than clocks. On the way down, the house smelt of boiled potatoes and floor wax. In the kitchen, the seamstress had left her thimble on the table, a dent pressed in the tin. He touched it and left it as he had found it. In the doorway, the wine boy glanced in, then withdrew without making a story of it. Outside, the street had that half-lit hour when shops expect one more sale and the day insists it has finished. He felt the case settle not into solution, but into a pace he recognized. He would wait now. He would watch. The person who had used only a small, precise force would not survive 2 more days of the lamp burning in their head. Noon has a way of arriving whether one stands in the square or not. The 2 days before Sunday passed with the slowness Maigret had expected. He did not summon the suspects again. He did not order searches or make arrests. He let them breathe, each in their own small worlds, because people who carry guilt or fear find it heavier when no hand tries to take it from them. He knew well enough that silence, like damp weather, makes certain things swell until they cannot be contained. On Saturday, he walked through the market at Batignolles, his hat pulled low, his pipe unlit. The air smelled of onions, wet straw, and fish that had not sold fast enough. He stopped here and there, not because he needed to buy, but because people who live on lists of francs often pass through such markets to stretch them. He saw Victor darting between stalls, not selling, but talking, waving a brush as if it were an emblem of fraternity. He laughed loudly and too often, though his eyes flitted nervously to corners, as if he feared a shadow would step out. Maigret did not approach him. He watched long enough to see that Victor still smoked the dark cigarettes, still crushed them quickly, and still carried the smell of polish like a second skin. A man like that could not keep secrets for long. Secrets rotted in his pockets until they fell out in gestures. Later, he walked toward Rue des Moines. The shop was closed for the day, but through the glass he saw Madame Berthaud bent over a length of fabric, alone, her hands moving steadily, even without the hum of machines. She had not noticed him. Her back was straight, her movements sharp. She was a woman who worked not to forget, but to prevent memory from having time to sit down. He thought of her words. He wanted to be time. And how they had carried no melodrama, only exhaustion. A woman like that could endure much, but not endlessly. He left her in peace. That evening at home, Madame Maigret set out a dish of cold beef and salad. They spoke of nothing in particular. Afterward, he sat by the window, his pipe smoke curling in the half-dark. His wife knitted, the needles clicking gently. At one point she said, "Some men count to know what they have. Others count to prove they are alive." He did not ask which kind she thought Darras had been. She rarely gave him opinions, only statements that settled into him like stones in water. On Sunday morning, the streets near Saint-Lazare were still wet from night rain, though the sky had begun to clear. Maigret sent Desforges ahead, telling him to stand inside the church at noon and watch the door. He himself took a place across the square, where he could see the clock face and the steps at once. The bells of Saint-Augustin tolled the hour, slow and heavy, each stroke rolling across the roofs. The congregation spilled out in its usual mixture, women in modest hats, men with collars too tight, children tugging at hands. Some hurried away as if the day were theirs already, others lingered in groups. Among them he saw Madame Berthaud, her dark dress unchanged, her step neither fast nor slow. She carried no prayer book. She did not look back at the church. She looked ahead, her eyes fixed on the square. Not far from her, Lemoyne appeared, hat in hand, pretending to study the announcements posted by the door, though his eyes moved with small jerks toward her. He coughed once. She did not turn. Victor came too, later, drifting around the edges like a man who belongs nowhere. He tipped his hat to a woman he didn't know, offered a brush to a passerby who ignored him, then leaned on the wall and lit a cigarette. He exhaled as if it were enough to prove he existed. Maigret waited. He knew that if Darras had once stood at this hour to watch, then someone among these three would feel the absence and fill it with their own act. He watched Madame Berthaud cross the square with the calmness of a woman who would not be made to hurry. Lemoyne hesitated, then followed at a short distance, his polished shoes gleaming against the wet stones. Victor, seeing them, flicked his cigarette and drifted too, a shadow with brushes. They did not meet, not openly. Madame Berthaud walked on, turned into Rue des Moines, vanished into the life that was hers. Lemoyne slowed, stopped, then turned back toward the station as if he had remembered an appointment. Victor remained in the square, looking restless, then finally slouched toward the cafe and called for a coffee he could not pay for. Maigret crossed to Desforges, who had been watching from the church steps with earnest concentration. The young man reported quickly, "The woman came alone." The traveler followed her. He coughed. He looked as if he wished to speak but did not. The brush seller wandered. No one else gave notice. "That is enough," Maigret said. He returned to the quay and wrote a brief note for the magistrate, setting out the facts without embroidery. But he did not mention guilt or accusation. He spoke of a man who kept accounts, of 3 others whose lives intersected with his at points too close to be chance, of a death caused not by theft but by memory. He ended the note with, "The truth will reveal itself when silence becomes too heavy." That evening he visited the Batignolles house again. The landlady had placed flowers in a small glass on the landing outside Darras's door. She looked at him with tired eyes. as if asking whether the house would ever be ordinary again. He told her softly that it would, but not yet. In the room itself, the lamp stood cold. He sat once more in the chair and looked at the table, the cigarettes, the blotter. He thought of Lemoine coughing on the landing, unable to enter but unable to leave. Of Victor, nervous, desperate, talking too much. Of Claire, who had lived with a weight she had never written down but which Darras had insisted on recording. 3 lives orbiting a man who believed every name should be counted. He rose and closed the door gently. In the corridor, the seamstress's light burned faintly under her door. She was humming as she worked, not happily, not sadly, just the sound of someone pushing time along. He left the house and walked back toward the boulevard. The city was quiet, the air washed, the lamps glowing. He knew the case was not finished, but it was. Nearer. Someone would break. Not because of his questions, but because of the lamp that still burned in their thoughts, the chain that slid into place too easily, the photograph that refused to stay face down. Maigret's task was to wait and to be present when silence turned into words. He drew on his pipe, the smoke tasting of damp tobacco, and walked home slowly, carrying with him not evidence but the weight of ordinary people bound by debts that could not be measured in francs. Monday began with a sky the color of damp stone, the kind of light that makes the city hesitate between waking and drifting. At the quay, the clerks moved quickly but without conviction, papers passing from one desk to another as if they carried no weight. Maigret sat with his pipe unlit, staring at the list of names. Each word on the page had become a door, some leading to ordinary rooms, some locked, some opening onto empty air. He knew better than to rush them. Doors in Paris open when they choose. Longyon arrived mid-morning with his usual air of grievance. He dropped a folded report on the desk and scowled at the smoke that was not there. The magistrate is impatient. He wants to know when you will bring him someone he can question. He does not like waiting for men who sit in chairs and smoke. Neither do men who strangle, Maigret said mildly. He tapped the page with a thick finger. Have you checked the others? These names that are neither Victor, nor Lemoine, nor Claire. Longyon shrugged. A laundry woman, a clerk, a man who sells coal by the sack. None of them left their beds on Tuesday night. All of them owe something to someone. None of them owed enough to kill. Everyone owes enough to kill, Maigret murmured. But he knew Longyon was right. The circle had tightened. By noon he left the quay and walked again to Rue des Batignolles. The wine shop boy was stacking bottles, slower than before, his eyes watchful. He looked up eagerly. Monsieur le Commissaire. Yesterday the man with the small brim, Victor, he quarreled with the commercial traveller. I saw them by the tram stop. The traveller pushed him, not hard, but as if to say he was tired of being followed. Victor shouted that he wasn't the only one who owed. And what did Lemoine say? He said nothing. He straightened his tie and walked off. But his face was red. Maigret thanked him with a nod and went up to the house. The landlady met him at the door, wringing her hands as always. Mademoiselle Arnaud has been crying all morning, she whispered. She pricks her fingers more than she sews. Something weighs on her. He went to the kitchen where the seamstress sat with her work, eyes rimmed red, her thimble lying useless on the table. She rose quickly when he entered. I cannot keep it, she said before he asked. It is too heavy. She held out a scrap of paper, crumpled, damp with the sweat of her hand. On it was written, in her small, sharp script, he asked me to keep it safe. A list, he said, if anything happened, to give it to the police. Maigret unfolded it. The names were the same as before, but beside Claire's was written not a figure, but a single word. Child. He looked at her quietly. She twisted her fingers. He gave it to me 2 weeks ago. He said it was in case men did not believe him. I did not know what to do. I thought he was only orderly, as always. But when he died, I feared they would say I was part of it. You are part of it now, Maigret said gently, because you gave it. He put the paper in his pocket. That is enough. She nodded, relief trembling in her shoulders. When he stepped back into the street, he found Lemoine waiting near the corner, as if he had rehearsed being casual and failed. His shoes shone even in the dull light. He tipped his hat. "Commissaire, may I speak?" His voice was taut. Maigret motioned him to walk. They moved slowly, past shuttered shops. "I did not kill him," Lemoine said quickly. Too quickly. "But I wanted to. I admit it. I saw him torment her. Claire, he would not let her live her life. He wrote everything as if sins were coins. I went to tell him to stop. I coughed because my throat was dry. I could not go in. He looked at me with his ledger eyes. I left." His face was pale now, sweat shining at the hairline. "If he is dead, it is not by my hand." "Yet you would have been relieved," Maigret said. Lemoine stopped walking. His polished shoes splashed in a shallow puddle, a detail he did not notice. "Yes," he whispered, relieved. Maigret left him standing and returned toward Rue des Moines. The shop was open, the hum of sewing machines steady. Claire looked up as he entered, then dismissed the girls again. She seemed more tired, as though sleep had become a thing she could no longer afford. He placed the crumpled scrap of paper on the table. She did not touch it. "Child," he said softly. Her face did not change, but her eyes closed briefly, as if from a sudden bright light. "He would not forget," she said. "He thought memory was justice. He thought reminding was kindness. He thought my life was still that of a girl who had sinned. He was wrong. I told him. He came again. And you?" "I endured. Endurance is what women do when men insist on remembering. I endured until someone else did not. You know who." She tied a knot in the thread she was holding, pulled it taut, and snipped it clean. "A man who coughs when he has nothing to say, a man who thinks polishing shoes can cover what is underneath. Or perhaps a woman who sews knots so tight she cannot breathe. I do not know. But it was not me." Her voice held no plea, no defense, only fatigue. That evening, back at the quay, Desforges reported that Victor had been seen bragging in a cafe that he knew more than the police, that he could tell who killed the man if he wished, but no one listened to him. He had been thrown out for not paying. "Bring him tomorrow," Maigret said. The next day, Victor sat in the same chair Lemoine had hovered over. He tried his smile, but it cracked quickly. "I did not strangle him. I am not strong. My hands are made for brushes, not cords." "You were there." "I was. I left. The traveler was behind me. Ask him. He hates me, but he will tell you that." He stood on the landing, coughing into his tie. "You crushed the dark cigarette." Victor shrugged. "I am careless. I crush everything. That does not make me a murderer." Maigret watched him a long moment, then leaned forward. Whoever killed him did not do it in anger. It was quiet, precise, without struggle. That is not your way. You are noise. Whoever killed him wanted not money, not even silence, but erasure. Victor's eyes darted. "Then it was her," he whispered. "The seamstress. She knows tricks with string. She is small, but anger is stronger than muscle." Or Claire herself. She had cause. They all had cause. Not me. When Victor had gone, Maigret sat alone. The lamp from the Batignolles room seemed to burn again in his mind, pointing at the chair. Darras had waited for someone, and that someone had come. The chain had been slid open with care, not broken. The act had been close, intimate, the pressure precise. Not a man's hurried violence, but something quieter, more deliberate. He thought of the seamstress, pricking her fingers, her small shoes worn thin. He thought of the string she knew how to use, the thimble left on the kitchen table, the humming through her door. He thought of Claire, the photograph turned to the wall, the child she had lost, the endurance in her eyes. He thought of Lemoine, coughing on the landing, polished shoes, a conscience he polished too. And Victor, who scattered lies like dust but could not hold a truth steady. It was not yet finished, but it was close. He would not rush. The truth was like smoke. If one waved at it, it vanished. If one sat still, it circled and settled, revealing its shape. He would wait, watch, let their silences ripen. Someone's silence was already turning into words, heavy enough to break. He leaned back in his chair, struck a match, and lit his pipe. The flame caught, then burned steady. The smoke rose in patient spirals, filling the office with its familiar haze. He let it rise, knowing that soon, very soon, one of them would come not to accuse, not even to confess, but simply because they could no longer bear the lamp that stayed on in their thoughts. The heavy air inside the boarding house seemed to thicken as Maigret rose from his chair, his broad frame casting a shadow across the dimly lit parlor. He had been silent for a long time, watching the others fidget in their seats, each of them waiting for the moment they dreaded. The sound of the rain against the windows was steady, almost hypnotic, but within the room every breath was held taut. The housekeeper sat with her, hands twisted in her lap. The lodger by the stove shifted nervously, and the tall, pale man in the corner avoided every pair of eyes. Maigret, with the patience of someone who had already weighed every word and found its proper place, finally began to speak. "You have all told me what you remember, what you saw, what you claim not to have seen," he said slowly, as though each syllable carried its own weight. "But the truth of these walls is quieter than your words. The truth is written in the silences, in the hesitations, in the things left unsaid." No one answered. They were waiting for the blow to fall, each of them hoping it might not land where they feared. Maigret's gaze shifted to the pale man in the corner, the one who had insisted from the first that he had only been passing through, that he barely knew the victim. The man's collar was damp with sweat despite the chill. Maigret's voice remained calm, almost weary. "You said you were not in the house that evening. You said you had gone to the café, that you returned only when the commotion had already begun. Yet the mud from the courtyard path was on your shoes when I first spoke with you, fresh, wet mud. It had not rained until after midnight." The man's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. His hands, clasped tightly together, trembled. The others turned to look at him, and the silence deepened. Maigret drew out his pipe, unlit, rolling it between his fingers as though it steadied his thoughts. "The victim knew you," Maigret went on. "He knew you better than you wanted us to think. He had written your name on a slip of paper, hidden but not well enough. And there was fear in that note, fear of something you had already done or were about to do. It was not a quarrel between strangers. It was something much closer." At that, the man flinched. His voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "You cannot prove." "I do not need to prove," Maigret cut in, his tone still even. "You have already proven it yourself. When you denied knowing him, when you hesitated each time I asked where you were, when you avoided the other's eyes. Proof lies in more than objects, monsieur. It lies in how a man breathes when he thinks the walls are closing in." The housekeeper gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. The lodger by the stove shifted further away, as though the man's guilt might be contagious. The pale man stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. For a moment, Maigret thought he might bolt for the door, but there was no strength in him, only the residue of fear and fatigue. He sank back down, burying his face in his hands. The confession, when it came, was halting, bitter, and full of self-pity. He spoke of debts, of anger, of a meeting gone wrong in the shadowy parlor. He had not meant, he said, for it to happen, but the victim's threats had pushed him. He described the act in broken sentences, as though ashamed even to hear his own words. The room was so silent that every syllable seemed to echo. The truth, once spoken, lost its menace. It became another weary tale of human weakness, sordid and small beneath the weight of the rain outside. Maigret listened without interruption, his heavy features unreadable. He knew, as he always knew, that the crime itself was less shocking than the dull, grinding inevitability of how it had come about. There was no triumph in the reveal, no sense of victory, only a tired recognition of how lives tangled together until one of them snapped. When the man finished, Maigret sighed softly, put his pipe back in his pocket, and gestured to the waiting officers at the door. They stepped forward and led the trembling figure away. The house slowly exhaled. The housekeeper wept quietly into her apron. The lodger muttered something about never having suspected, though his eyes betrayed relief that suspicion had turned elsewhere. One by one they returned to their own corners of silence, their own burdens, their own small deceptions. Maigret did not press them further. Their secrets were of a different order, too petty or too sad to matter now. Later, walking back through the misty streets, Maigret drew his coat tighter against the rain. The city glistened under the lamplight, the gutters rushing with water. He did not feel satisfaction, nor sorrow, only the familiar heaviness that came with the end of such cases. It was not evil that haunted him most, but the ordinariness of it all, the way ordinary men and women, under pressure of fear, loneliness, or pride, could be pushed to act in ways that destroyed lives. He stopped at a cafe, ordered a glass of beer, and sat alone, watching the drops slide down the window. The investigation was over. The paperwork, the magistrate, the rest of it would follow in due course. But for now, there was only the quiet presence of the rain, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another name, another story, another room full of silence to listen to. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the smoke curling slowly in the air, and let his eyes rest on the street beyond the glass. The city breathed around him, indifferent and eternal, as he sat with his thoughts. The case was closed, but the weight of human frailty, he knew, never lifted. It merely shifted, waiting for the next doorbell in the night, the next voice on the telephone, the next life unraveling in the shadows of Paris, 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 in the shadows of Paris,